Okay, welcome back, and also looking forward to our special guest today, Alex Newman. He's the senior editor there at the New American, and he's an international journalist, author, and the host who reports on globalism, education, and national sovereignty. He's the author of Indoctrinating Our Children to Death and Deep State. He is the president of the Liberty Sentinel Media and contributes to both the Epoch Times, WorldNet Daily, and other publications. He does have a website, thenewamerican.com, and there's the picture of that web page, thenewamerican.com. Alex, good to see you. Wow, lots to talk about here. You just got back from the United Nations Climate Summit. It looks like you survived.
Barely. It's great to be with you, Perry. Thank you very much.
Good to see you again. So,
you too.
What was your take?
Well, there's a lot of different angles. Obviously, they got the final agreement, as they do every year. They add one more brick into the global climate regime that they're building. They didn't make quite as much progress as they would have liked, but they did make some very significant advances. $1.3 trillion per year in wealth redistribution was agreed to. Basically, that'll come from middle-class taxpayers in the United States and what's left of what we used to call Christendom to be redistributed to kleptocrats in the third world. They got really significant progress on monitoring and evaluation tools, which will be a critical component for eventual enforcement of these climate agendas. But a lot of the really significant action actually happened on the sidelines. They weren't able to get consensus around a lot of the key issues that they wanted to address. So they created these ad hoc groupings where they came up with agreements that governments could join at will. One of them is about silencing misinformation and disinformation on climate change. So we're talking about censorship. And they made clear at the summit, we're not just talking about people who question the so-called science, the hypothesis that CO2 emitted by humans is destroying the planet, but even the people who question the supposed solutions to this alleged crisis are now going to be in the crosshairs. They got over 85 governments to agree to a roadmap on phasing out fossil fuels, hydrocarbon energy, so they'll be having a meeting on that in Colombia next year. And so they did make some very significant progress. But for me, the really significant takeaway is just how clear it's becoming now that this is actually a spiritual battle. You had the Chinese Communist Party, the most murderous organization in human history, donate this big, they call it a dragon jaguar guardian spirit, a statue of a demonic-looking figure with big horns, supposed to be some kind of humanoid dragon guardian, whatever, holding the world in its hands. Obviously, Brazilians, Catholic country, were outraged by this. They said Brazil belongs to Jesus, not your little demonic dragon jaguar guardian spirit. But fascinating event. And then, of course, they arrested the top member of the political opposition while we were down there, Jair Bolsonaro, the former president, on what I consider to be transparently bogus charges of leading a coup. So incredible stories.
Wow, there's a lot there. Was our UN ambassador there?
No, this was really interesting, Perry. For the first time in 30 years of doing these climate summits, the U.S. government did not have a single person there. The State Department confirmed to us they did not send one single representative. They said they didn't want to waste taxpayer money and that this conference was dedicated to bankrupting the United States, and so they weren't going to play along, which... You know, there's two ways of looking at this, right? The Trump administration looked at this as kind of a boycott. You know, what are you going to do without us? We pay all the bills. You know, we're the ones you're trying to strap down. What are you going to do without us? But I'll tell you what, there was a very different sentiment at the conference. The former head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the climate bureaucracy, the climate machinery, actually boasted. Her name is Christiana Figueres. She said, I think it's great that the United States didn't show up because that way they can't get in the way of consensus. We'll be able to adopt a tougher roadmap. And a lot of the leading activists and legal operatives said the same thing. They said, hey, this is great. Trump's not here to mess up our plans. We'll create a new agreement. We'll create another one next year. And then when Trump is gone, in 3.5 years, we'll bring in the next American president, and then they will enforce all this. It'll be binding on the United States. And I think Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who did show up to campaign for president and talk about what he was doing to save the climate, he, I think, really encapsulated the sentiment well when he said, Trump is an invasive species. He's not a permanent fixture of American politics. So don't worry about it. America's still in. California's still in. Trump will be gone soon enough, and we'll get right back to pedal to the metal on these climate so-called issues.
So where do they get the money in the meantime?
Well, the Communist Chinese stepped up for sure. The UN has a lot of institutional momentum. And of course, the United States still provides 1/3 of all the funding for the institutional UN. The U.S. taxpayer is still paying for a lot of this. Trump did cut off a lot of the funding sources that are specifically dedicated to climate change, but they've got a lot of money. And where the United States steps back, the European Union typically steps in. Germany, Japan likes to fund a lot of these things. So they definitely were not short on money, I can tell you that.
Was the change of attitude of Bill Gates felt?
Well, we asked a lot of people about it, and I'll tell you what, being inside the UN venue, you're like in a whole different universe. So the moment you step outside the conference, every Brazilian we talked to except one, and I speak Portuguese. I lived in Brazil many years. I speak fluent Portuguese. We spoke with every Brazilian we could find that would talk to us. We didn't find but one single person who even believed that human activities were causing climate change. I mean, that's how disconnected these people in the COP were. But then you had 50, 60,000 people in there who think this is the most pressing problem facing humanity, and we have to burn down our economies and give up our liberty and our national sovereignty to save it. So we asked a lot of people, what do you say about Donald Trump saying that this is the biggest con job in the history of humanity? In fact, while we were down there, Trump said in a talk to the Saudis that this appears to be a criminal conspiracy, this promotion of climate hysteria. And he said maybe they ought to be investigated. Maybe they are being investigated. So we asked about that. And of course, to your point, we asked about Bill Gates saying, maybe this isn't quite as big a deal as we thought. Certainly not the most pressing problem. Humans are going to continue to thrive with or without climate change. So that certainly put a damper in it. But it was like the 800-pound gorilla in the room that nobody wanted to acknowledge, right? So they didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to pretend like that wasn't happening to the best of their ability. And that's because everybody's incentive, everybody who's involved in this process, their livelihood depends on this, their organizations depend on this, their funding depends on this. So I think there was a very real, sense of, hey, let's just wait for Trump to be gone, and then Bill Gates will be back on the bandwagon, and we'll all be good.
In the meantime, what little I've tried to keep up with this, so many things to keep up with, but we still have another 3 years of President Trump, and there is thought that his disdain for this particular issue as it relates to the UN could result in the U.S. leaving the UN and the UN leaving the U.S. Then where does that leave him? That's hypothetical, but where does it leave him?
Yeah, and this is a very serious subject of discussion. Trump's got a number of options on the table. One of the ones that a lot of the skeptics are urging him to exercise is to just withdraw from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the underlying 1992 treaty that set this whole process in motion. If the United States were to withdraw, that would get us out of all 30 of the subsequent agreements that were tacked on to the end of that, and it would make it very difficult for a future president and a future U.S. Senate to get us back involved. Americans overwhelmingly don't even believe that man-made global warming is an issue. Even those who do believe don't consider it a serious threat. So they would have a major problem if Trump were to withdraw from the UNFCCC. That would set them back a long way on the climate agenda specifically. Now, the bigger issue that you mentioned, getting out of the UN entirely, this is the first time in my lifetime where that appears to be a realistic prospect. Whether that'll happen or not, we have to see. But there is a bill in both houses of Congress that's called the Defund Act, the Disengaging Entirely from the United Nations Debacle Act. It's introduced by Chip Roy in the House and Senator Mike Lee in the Senate. I have spoken with Chip Roy extensively on this, and there's growing support for this in Congress. And depending on what day you catch President Trump, the UN is either a terrible joke that is funding an assault on our borders in the form of mass migration and perpetuating the biggest con job in the history of humanity, or it's got great potential. And but there is a very real sense now that the United States could leave. And there's also, incidentally, growing talk of the UN kicking us out. In fact, there was an article on Opinio Juris, which is a major outfit that works with the International Commission of Jurists, arguing that maybe it's time to expel the United States from the UN in the same way that they did to the apartheid government in South Africa, because apparently they think we're being disruptive, even though we still pay a third of the bills. So I personally think that would be one of the best things that could happen to the United States of America to get us out of this institution. But we'll have to see if there's appetite in Congress and if the president would sign that bill.
Isn't our support of Israel in the UN also a bone in their cross, so to speak? I mean, they could kick us both out.
Of course, and Israel is always public enemy number one, or at least it was until Donald Trump showed up. Now, he, I think, is public enemy number one for the moment. But if you look, even the sub-agencies, the specialized agencies of the UN, they obsess constantly with Israel. Like over 90% of the resolutions they pass against particular countries, against particular governments, are directed at the Israelis, at the Jews. And yeah, I think people look at that, and even people who don't like Israel look at that and say, really? Israel's the worst country in the world, that it gets 90% of the red. What about North Korea? What about Syria? What about Iran? What about communist China, which has murdered more people than any other government in the history of humanity? So there's been this back and forth going on for a long time. During Trump's first term, we withdrew from a lot of UN agencies, and the Israelis followed us out of, for example, UNESCO. So we'll see. I think it would probably be a very good thing for Israel to have the United States out. But then there's the other school of thought that having the United States be part of the Security Council with a veto allows the U.S. government to protect Israel from some of the worst excesses of the UN. But there's a very real question about what would happen to the UN without the United States. Would it even continue to exist as a legitimate institution? And I would argue that it probably would not.
Yeah. Is the science community becoming more split over this issue?
More and more scientists are starting to get the courage to speak out, because for a long time they all understood that their careers, their funding was dependent on this climate hoax. And so a lot of them were scared to speak out. But I've interviewed hundreds of scientists over the years on this, a lot of them at these UN summits, a lot of them who have worked for the UN. And what I have noticed is more and more they're willing to speak out about the pseudoscience underpinning a lot of this hysteria. I've even interviewed scientists who were serving on the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, like Dr. Nils Morner. I interviewed him a few years ago. He was their lead sea level reviewer. And he told me on the record that the UN is basically lying. There is no global sea level rise. In fact, there's no such thing as even a global sea level. If anything, he said the ocean levels are probably going down a little bit, but to even talk about this is preposterous. And he said when the UN wouldn't listen to him, he just had to resign. He said he couldn't have his name attached to lies that they were publishing. So we're seeing a lot more pushback now. Donald Trump's climate advisor from his first term, Dr. Will Happer of Princeton, I've interviewed him on the record many times. He says CO2 is actually good for the world. We're in an atmosphere that is starving for more CO2. That's why farmers pump it into their greenhouses. So I think the scientific so-called consensus around climate change has really evaporated. And I think that's why they're getting more desperate now to censor the internet. That's why they're openly saying we have to silence what they call misinformation and disinformation, because they know people don't believe this stuff anymore.
Yeah. All right, let me take a quick break. Let me say to our viewers, check out Alex's book entitled Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. There's a picture of the cover of the book. The other one is Deep State. You can go to thenewamerican.com. That's his home website, newamerican.com. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, and very timely to have back with us Alex Newman. He is the senior editor there at the New American. By the way, his latest book is a great read. It's called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, and there's a picture of the cover of the book there on the screen by Alex Newman. His website is thenewamerican.com. Alex, I want to squeeze in a couple of questions here. I'm trying to figure out how to ask this. It seems to me that there is a huge difference between extreme environmentalism and genuine conservation. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And I think it's an important distinction to make. You know, God called upon us to be good stewards of the planet. Our friends over at the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation do a wonderful job of explaining this. And it's very clear that there are real environmental problems that ought to be addressed. Communist China is Exhibit A. The sky is filthy. The soil is filthy. They release all sorts of toxic chemicals into the sky. They dump endless amounts of trash and plastic and garbage into the oceans. These are real issues that ought to be addressed. And as Christians, we want to be good stewards of the planet God has given us. But at the same time, when you get into this extreme environmentalism that's so prevalent at the UN, I would argue, first of all, that as the Trump administration put it, we're not really even talking about serious environmentalism here. We're actually talking about wealth redistribution disguised as environmentalism. But on another level, there's a real element of what Romans 1 describes, worshiping the creature, the creation, rather than the creator. And I've seen this become increasingly prominent at these UN summits. A few years ago, I was in Egypt for the COP that they held in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they had all these religious leaders from around the world walk up to the top of what they said was Mount Sinai and unveil the new and improved 10 Commandments. One of those 10 Commandments says humans must love and serve this interdependent, life-giving earth. We need to be clear, the earth is a rock. The earth was put here by God for his glory and our benefit. we were instructed to take dominion of the earth and the animals and the plants. And yes, we want to be good stewards of the planet. We don't want to pollute the planet. And then there's this other issue of, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not pollution. And yet the entire premise behind this climate charade is the idea that carbon dioxide, human emissions of CO2, are toxic pollution that need to be controlled by the UN. So from a scientific perspective, obviously that's ludicrous, right? CO2 does not control the temperature of the planet. We're at historically low levels of CO2 in the atmosphere right now, as I mentioned. But from a totalitarian perspective, demonizing CO2 as pollution is the absolute perfect tool for taking control over every element of life, because literally every activity that a human does results in CO2, including, by the way, breathing. We exhale about 2 pounds of CO2 every single day. And just to be clear, human emissions of CO2 make up a fraction of 1% of all the greenhouse gases naturally in the atmosphere. And so we need to be clear here. There's real environmentalism, which, I would consider myself an environmentalist. I want a clean environment. I want clean water and clean air for my children and for my grandchildren. And then there's this phony, socialism, globalism, pantheism, paganism understanding of environmentalism, which is being used as a pretext to unite the religions of the world together, smash national sovereignty, and rearrange the global economy in a way that is completely at odds, I think, with biblical principles.
Okay, you said earlier Americans who assume the UN climate change won't impact them is an issue. And I want to kind of dig down on that just for a few seconds here, and that is if the United States doesn't push back on this and stay in the UN, this becomes a big issue, because the bottom line here, if I'm hearing you correctly, the ultimate...
I lost sound, guys.
Oh, there you are. Oh, there you go. Okay. So the ultimate thing here is the goal of the UN, in a surrogate way, is to replace God. The UN and its climate change policies is to literally control the creation of all things and call themselves God. That's a big step, but at the end of the day, that's where it's heading if we don't wake up.
That is absolutely where it's heading. And it's a subject that I've been talking about for many, many years. I've been going to these climate conferences for 15 years now. And Americans need to understand, they assume that because they're not hearing about this in their newspaper, in the local media, that it's not an issue. This climate change hypothesis is the fundamental justification for the creation of global governance, really global government, for the rearranging of the global economy toward a technocratic control grid rather than a free market system, and also for a uniting of the religions of the world. This has been happening very, very openly now. They actually discuss this whole process as a three-legged stool. The first leg is the political, the public, the government side, where the UN comes in, brings together all the national governments of the world. The second leg is the economic side, the private sector. So you have, for example, the World Economic Forum bringing together the big businesses. You have the co-chair of the World Economic Forum, Larry Fink of BlackRock, bringing all the big companies and even the small companies on board. And then you have the religious side, where you have organizations like Religions for Peace, which describes itself as the UN of religions, claims to speak for all the religions in the world, bringing all of the religions of the world together under the guise of this climate change thing. So it's a very real threat. It's an existential threat to Christian civilization, to individual liberty, to our constitutional form of government, certainly to our national sovereignty. And then when it comes to U.S. involvement, I do believe that if the United States were to completely withdraw from all this, the whole thing would fall apart. What they are doing through the climate process, one of the many things they're doing through the climate process, is shutting down our industry by causing electricity to be increasingly unaffordable. They've been shutting down our power plants for years. They've been making it very difficult to do business in the United States, even while communist China builds 2 coal-fired power plants every week. Their CO2 emissions are 300% of American CO2 emissions and climbing, while ours are falling off a cliff. So if we would leave this whole process, if the United States would say, we're not going to be bound by any of this anymore, we're going to build as many power plants as we need to power our industries, we're going to bring back manufacturing, the communist Chinese, everybody else would say, well, we can't participate in this either. So the whole thing would fall apart without American money and American participation. But I do think people need to understand this is a very real threat. And to take it one step further, they understand that we're the bitter clingers, as Barack Obama referred to us famously some years ago, clinging to our guns and our Bibles. But they also understand that if they can capture the hearts and minds of the next generation, which is a top priority for them, UNESCO held a session at this COP30 where they said the key element of this whole process is educating children not just to understand climate change, but to take action on it. If they can capture the hearts and minds of our children, they know that it's just a matter of time. It may take a whole generation, maybe even two, to get to their final destination. But if they have the children, and right now they do, they know it's just a waiting game.
Scripture says God won't be mocked.
Amen.
So I understand these threats. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to trivialize them or make them nothing, but they're very real. There's no question about it. But I've also seen God confuse people and mix man's plans up to where they can't exist. Do you sense that could be happening?
Absolutely. I mean, Genesis chapter 11 is a perfect example of that. God told them to spread out, and they build a big tower, and God comes down and confuses their languages. We saw that at the COP30. As they were in there negotiating how we're going to get rid of fossil fuels in the Western world, a big fire breaks out, and of course, fossil-fueled fire trucks have to show up using fossil fuel chemicals to put out the fire. So God's got a good sense of humor. I love Psalm 2, written by David 3,000 years ago, where he talks about the kings of the earth and the rulers conspiring together, taking counsel together against God and his anointed one. Verse 4 says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. He holds them in derision, and he's going to speak to them in his wrath, it says in verse 5. So this is a fool's errand. These people will eventually be stopped. Evil will be defeated, and we should all praise God for that.
Do you think there are more Bill Gates out there that'll exit?
I don't think Bill Gates is fully exited. He did indicate that he doesn't believe this is the biggest problem in the world right now. I think it's more of a strategic retreat. Right now, he's got a vested interest in building endless AI data centers that are going to consume a massive amount of power. They know they're not going to be able to get away with that if they shut down all our power plants. So I think he's looking at this from the perspective of, well, the AI is a more important tool for accomplishing my agenda than the climate change hoax right now. So we'll step back on the climate change issue for a moment, wait for Donald Trump to leave, and then we'll get right back to it.
Is there let me just say, a white paper available that people could take to, say, a state legislator committee to combat, green laws that will just ruin business? I mean, is there stated facts that people could use in subcommittee hearings to say, you guys are full of baloney, quit putting these rules on companies and bankrupting them?
And I think states should be doing that. In fact, I asked 7 U.S. senators at the COP28 on the Arabian Peninsula a few years ago how they could be making all these promises when it really looked like Donald Trump was about to be the next president. They said, oh, don't worry. We've directed billions of dollars to Republican congressional districts and Republican states through the Inflation Reduction Act to make sure they're all hooked on the money. We're building constituencies there. But there are all kinds of scientific studies that show this is fraudulent. In fact, in a very recent issue of the New American, we published an excellent article by my friend Dr. Willie Soon. Probably the world's top astrophysicist. He spent decades at Harvard University. He has now left and created his own independent organization. But we've got a wonderful article in there called Climate Change Forever. He's got multiple peer-reviewed studies published just in the last few years showing that virtually all, if not all, of the warming that has been observed over the last few decades, a tiny little bit, could easily be attributed to changes in total solar irradiance as tracked by NASA. So there's a lot of information on this at the New American magazine. Many legislators actually use our magazine in committee hearings, and certainly state governments could take concrete steps to say, we're not going to allow you to shut down our power plants. We're not going to allow you to shut down our industry. We're certainly not going to allow you to bankrupt the people of our state with all these green mandates coming out of D.C. Trump has hit the brakes on those, to be clear, but I have no doubt that they will be back under a future president if Trump doesn't drive a stake through the heart of them, and state governments would be a really good place to make our stand.
One last quick question, about a minute or less, and you certainly cover this in your book about our children being indoctrinated. How far down does that go?
The UN's actually a key player. They've got the World Core Curriculum that the guy who wrote it said is based on the teachings of Alice Bailey, the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. So I would encourage people to check out the book. It's been endorsed by our Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, many great Americans, General Michael Flynn, former National Security Advisor, because this is one of the most important issues. If we don't protect our children, we are going to be in very big trouble. And I thank you very much for having me on the program, Perry.
Yeah. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, go to thenewamerican.com. That is the website. There's a picture of that landing page, thenewamerican.com. And check out Alex's books, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death and Deep State. You could look for his articles there in Epoch Times and the World Net Daily and other publications. Alex, you're fascinating. Thank you, friend. God bless you. Stay in the fight. We need you.
God bless you, too. Thank you so much.